There is a kind of courage that defies even the darkest of fates, a strength so unyielding it echoes through the ages. Tonight, we step into one of the most heartbreaking tales ever woven in the legendarium of Middle-earth, the tragedy of Huron and his children, a story of pride, doom, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Whether you're listening under the quiet glow of midnight or the soft light of dawn, we'd love to know where in the world you've joined us from and what hour has drawn you into this journey. Let us know in the comments below, because every voice adds to the tapestry of this shared experience. Picture a lone warrior standing before the throne of Morgoth, the Dark Lord himself, his body battered but his spirit unbroken. This is Huron, a man of such defiance that even in chains, he refuses to bow. His story begins with an act of unimaginable bravery, but it's this very defiance that seals his fate and the fate of his family. Morgoth, enraged by Huron's unshakable will, curses not only him but his unborn children, Túrin and Niënor, twisting their lives into a web of sorrow and shadow. This isn't just a tale of darkness. It's a story about how love, pride, and the choices we make ripple across generations, shaping destinies in ways no one could foresee. What follows is a saga so profound, so deeply human, that it lingers long after the last word is spoken. It's a story of fathers and daughters, of brothers and sisters, of oaths sworn and destinies unfulfilled. But more than anything, it's a reminder of how even the brightest lights can be dimmed by the weight of fate. And yet, in that dimming, there's a beauty, a tragedy, that speaks to something eternal within us all. So settle in, wherever you are, and let's step into the world of Huron's children, where every choice carries the weight of the world, and every heartbreak is etched into the very fabric of legend. The iron grip of Morgoth's will was absolute, yet within the black halls of Angband, one man refused to bend. Huron, bound in chains of unbreakable dark metal, was given a fate crueler than death, forced to watch, through Morgoth's cursed vision, as the lives of those he loved unraveled like threads in a storm. Each moment was a torment, each vision a dagger twisting deeper, yet his spirit remained untouched. His silence was his defiance, a refusal to grant the Dark Lord even the satisfaction of a cry of despair. This only stoked Morgoth's fury, for what use was a prisoner who would not break? And so the curse grew heavier, its shadow stretching far beyond those grim halls, reaching for the ones Huron could not protect. Far from Angband's horrors, Morwin, heavy with child, clutched young Turin's hand as they fled through the wilds of Dor Laman. The land itself seemed to mourn, its winds carrying whispers of Huron's fate. Some said he was dead, others that he had betrayed his kin, but none knew the truth. The weight of uncertainty settled over Morwin like a shroud. Once proud and steadfast, she now moved through a world grown cold, her heart a battleground of grief and dread. Even the shelter of their halls offered no comfort, for every shadow seemed to whisper Morgoth's name, and in the stillness, the curse took root, not as fire or fury, but as a slow, creeping frost, doubt gnawing at trust, fear poisoning hope, until even the strongest bonds trembled. Turin, too young to understand the full weight of his father's fate, felt the change like a storm brewing just beyond sight. The laughter that once filled the halls of his childhood faded, replaced by silence and sidelong glances. The other children whispered when they thought he couldn't hear, their voices laced with pity or unease. No one spoke plainly of curses or doom, but the air itself was thick with it, pressing down until even breathing felt like defiance. And all the while, Morgoth's unseen hand turned the threads of their lives, weaving sorrow into every choice, every step, until the path ahead seemed less a road and more a snare. Yet even in the gathering dark, there were embers of light, small, fragile, but unyielding. Morwin's love for her children burned steady, a flame no shadow could fully smother. And though the curse sought to isolate them, to twist love into fear and pride into folly, it could not erase the truth that bound them, that even in the face of doom, some things endure. The tragedy of Huron's family was not just in their suffering, but in the way they fought against it, even when the fight itself seemed hopeless. For in the end, it is not the darkness that defines them, but the moments they refuse to let it win. The bitterness in young Turin's heart grew like thorns, twisting through his ribs, each barb a reminder of the whispers that followed him. Son of a traitor, child of a failed house. The scorn of Huron's enemies became his daily bread, and with every sneer, his pride hardened, not into armor, but into a blade turned inward. When Morwin, her hands trembling with unspoken fears, sent him away to the hidden kingdom of Darius, it was meant to be his salvation. Yet to Turin, the parting felt like surrender. The forests of Darius, luminous with elven magic, should have been a sanctuary, but the very beauty of it stung. How could these ageless trees, these untroubled halls, understand the fire gnawing at his bones? King Thingol, moved by pity, or perhaps some deeper foresight, welcomed the boy as one of his own. He offered him a place among the elves, where time flowed gentle as a river, and sorrows could, in theory, be soothed. But Turin was no elf. The grace of Darius, its poetry and patience, only made his human heart thrash like a caged wolf. Every kindness felt like a chain. Every lesson in diplomacy or history was a delay, a diversion from what he saw as his true purpose, to carve his family's name back into the world with steel and blood. Then came the moment that would unravel everything. A careless word from an elf, a jest that brushed too close to the wound of his father's fate, and Turin's hand flew to his sword. The scrape of metal against sheath was louder than any shout. In that heartbeat, the hall fell silent. To draw a weapon in Thingol's presence was more than rudeness. It was a fracture, a crack in the fragile peace he'd been granted. The elves recoiled, not in fear, but in sorrow. Here was the shadow of Morgoth's curse, not in some distant battlefield, but here, in the heart of their refuge, wearing the face of a grieving child. Turin's defiance wasn't just rebellion. It was the first thread pulled from a tapestry already fraying. His sword, once meant to defend, had become a mirror reflecting all the darkness he carried. And though Thingol, with weary wisdom, chose mercy over punishment, the damage was done. The boy who'd arrived with clenched fists and a heavier heart would leave Darius marked not just by his lineage, but by his choices. For every act of pride, every refusal to bend, would ripple outward, pulling him deeper into the very doom he sought to escape. Yet in that moment, as the echoes of his anger faded, there was something tragically human in his rage. A desperate, furious love for a father he barely remembered, for a home he couldn't return to. It's this that makes Turin's story so piercing. Not the battles or the curses, but the way a boy's love, twisted by grief, can become both his greatest strength and his undoing. There in the twilight of Darius, where even shadows seemed woven with silver, Turin found an unlikely anchor, Belleg's strongbow, an elf whose patience ran as deep as the roots of the ancient forest. Where others saw only a boy's simmering rage, Belleg glimpsed the unshaped steel beneath, the potential waiting to be honed. Their bond became a quiet rebellion against the curse, a proof that not all light could be smothered. Belleg taught him the bow's whisper, the stealth of the hunt, the way a blade could be both weapon and ward. For a time, the weight of Huron's fate seemed lighter, as if friendship alone could blunt Morgoth's malice. But the curse thrived on such fleeting hope. It slipped into the space between heartbeats, twisting a petty insult into a spark, then a flame, when an elf named Saros mocked Turin's mortal lineage, sneering at his father's rumored shame. The boy's restraint shattered. The quarrel spilled from words to blows, and in the chaos, Saros fell, his life bleeding into the moss beneath Darius's sacred trees. The act was not justice, nor even true vengeance, but a wild strike at the invisible chains Turin felt tightening around him. Yet the consequence was real. The elves' mercy had its limits, and blood spilled in anger could not be undone. With no path back, Turin did what he knew best. He ran. Not in fear, but in a fever of self-loathing, as if by embracing the role of outcast, he could outpace the doom chasing him. The band of outlaws he joined were men as broken as he, their names abandoned like shed skins. Among them, he became Niënor, the wronged, a title worn like armor. They roamed the wilds, stealing, fighting, surviving. Each raid a hammer strike against the world that had scorned them. And with every act of violence, Turin felt the curse coil tighter, whispering that this was all he was meant to be. Belleg, though, refused to let go. While Darius mourned the fraying of its peace, the elf shouldered his bow and followed. His loyalty wasn't blind. He saw the darkness in Turin, the way pride curdled into recklessness. But he also remembered the boy who'd once clutched a wooden sword with desperate hope, who'd flinched at the first touch of a real blade's weight. To abandon him now, Belleg believed, would be to surrender to Morgoth's design. So he tracked Turin through briar and bog, not to drag him back, but to stand beside him, a tether to the man he might still become. The tragedy, of course, was that the harder Belleg reached, the farther Turin twisted away. When the elf finally found the outlaw camp, his arrival should have been salvation. Instead, Turin's shame festered into suspicion. How could this elf, who moved through the world with grace and purpose, understand the rot inside him? Beleg's very goodness became a mirror, reflecting all Turin had lost, and so the curse worked its cruelest trick yet. It turned love into a weapon, ensuring that every outstretched hand would feel, to Turin, like a threat. In the end, even Beleg's steadfastness couldn't pierce the armor Turin had forged around himself. The boy who'd once wept for his father's fate now wore his suffering like a crown, mistaking stubbornness for strength. And with each passing day, the path back grew fainter, drowned beneath the thunder of hooves, the clash of stolen swords, the hollow laughter of men who'd forgotten their own names. The curse didn't need to break him. It simply let him believe he was already broken. The orcs came like a flood in the night, their crude blades glinting under a moon veiled by smoke. Turin fought with the wild fury of a cornered beast, but even his strength had limits. Chains bit into his wrists, and the jeers of his captors followed him into the darkness. What they planned for him was worse than death, a slow unraveling, a spectacle for Morgoth's amusement. But the curse, ever cruel, had another torment in store. Belleg moved through the enemy camp like a shadow, his bowstring silent, his knife swift. Every slain orc was a prayer, every step forward an act of defiance against the doom that sought to claim them both. When he finally reached Turin, the sight of his friend, bruised, bound, but alive, should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it became the hinge on which their tragedy turned. In the chaos of the escape, with orcish shouts ringing in their ears, Turin's hands, numb from captivity, fumbled with the ropes. Belleg reached for his sword to cut him free, and in the half-light, the blade flashed like a threat. What happened next was less a choice than a reflex, the body betraying the heart. Turin lunged, seizing the weapon from his friend's grip, and drove it home before his mind could catch up with his terror. The gasp that escaped Beleg's lips was softer than the rustle of leaves, yet it drowned out every other sound in the world. Recognition flickered in his eyes, not accusation, but sorrow, as if he'd always known the curse would demand this final price. And then he was gone, his blood staining the earth darker than the shadows that birthed it. The weight of that moment crushed Turin like a mountain. He cradled Beleg's body, his soaks the first honest tears he'd shed in years. This wasn't the death of a comrade, it was the murder of the one soul who'd refused to give up on him. The irony was unbearable. Belleg had died by the very hands he'd trained, his loyalty repaid with a blade. And as the dawn crept over the hills, Turin realized the curse had won in the worst way possible. It hadn't just taken Beleg's life, it had made him the instrument of his own despair. What followed was a wandering as hollow as the wind through dead branches. Turin, now truly nameless, let the wilderness carve him into something unrecognizable. He ate when he remembered, slept where he collapsed, spoke to no one. The world became a blur of gray days and endless nights, each step a futile attempt to outpace the ghost at his shoulder. It was Orodreth, a minor king with kindness worn thin by hardship, who finally pulled him from the abyss. In the dim halls of Nargothrond, they gave him a new name, Tirambar, Master of Doom, as if a word could shield him from the past. But names are fragile things. However fiercely Turin, no, Tirambar, clung to this new identity. The old wounds festered beneath. He took up arms again, not for glory, but for the vain hope that enough good deeds might outweigh that single, unforgivable act. Yet every battle felt like penance, not redemption. Every victory rang hollow, because the truth no one dared speak was this: some debts can't be repaid, only carried. And so, the man who'd once raged against his fate, now bowed beneath it, mistaking surrender for strength, silence for peace, the cruelest twist of all. In becoming Tirambar, he played right into Morgoth's hands. The Dark Lord hadn't needed to break him. He'd let Turin break himself, then handed him the pieces and called it freedom. And now, with every stride toward Nargothrond's wars, every hollow laugh shared with Orodreth's men, the curse coiled tighter, waiting for the next thread to pull. Because the past isn't a cloak you can shrug off. It's the marrow in your bones, the breath in your lungs, and sooner or later, it always whispers your name. The years stretched long and weary for Morwin, her bones aching with the weight of unanswered questions. With Huron lost to Angban's shadows and Turin vanished into the wilds of rumor, only Niënor remained, a daughter grown tall and fierce, her eyes holding the same fire as her father's. When word came of Turin's possible survival in the forests of Brethil, Morwin's resolve hardened like steel. She would not lose another child to the silence of fate. Together, mother and daughter set out, their cloaks damp with the mist of Dor Laman's farewell, unaware that every step carried them closer to the dragon's maw. Glaurung, eldest of Morgoth's winged terrors, had waited centuries for this moment. His golden eyes, slit like a serpent's, tracked their progress through the valley, his scales glinting with the patience of a predator who knows his prey is cornered. When he struck, it was not with flame or claw, but with a breath thick as poisoned fog. The mist coiled around Niënor, seeping into her lungs, her thoughts, her very soul. When it cleared, Morwin was gone, scattered like leaves in a gale, and Niënor stood alone, her mind as empty as a winter sky. The past was a locked door. Her name, her family, the love that had carried her this far, all vanished, leaving only the hollow echo of a question. Who am I? The forest of Brethil was kind to her in its way. The trees whispered no accusations. The streams asked for no history. She wandered, a wraith in daylight, until a woodsman found her, a woman with no memory, no fear, only a quiet exhaustion that mirrored his own. Turin, now called Tirambar, had spent years building walls around his heart, brick by brick, until even he believed the lie that he was free of his past. When he saw Niënor, pale as moonlight, her eyes wide with unspoken sorrow, something in him stirred, not recognition, but kinship. Here was another soul adrift, another casualty of a world too cruel to name its wounds. Their love was a quiet rebellion against the darkness, a fragile hope built on silence. He called her Ninyul, Tear Maiden, for the sorrow she could not explain. She, in turn, clung to him as the only anchor in her featureless world. Their marriage was a ceremony of whispers, a joining of two people who thought they had nothing left to lose. For a time, the curse seemed to sleep. The wind carried no whispers of doom, the stars held their tongues, but Glaurung, coiled in his mountain lair, knew the truth. This was no reprieve, only the cruelest stroke of all. Then came the day the dragon stirred again, his wings casting shadows like thunderclouds over Brethil. Turin, ever the warrior, rallied the men to face him, his sword hand steady despite the dread in his veins. Ninyul, though forbidden to follow, felt the pull of some nameless terror and trailed behind, her heart pounding with a fear she could not name. What she witnessed in that glade would unravel everything. Glaurung, bleeding but triumphant, turned his gaze upon her, and with his dying breath, he shattered the illusion. "Hail, Niënor, daughter of Huron," he hissed, the words slithering into her ears like venom. "How sweet to see you kneel before your brother's blade." The world fractured, memory rushed back, not as a river but as a flood, tearing through the dam of Glaurung's spell. She remembered Morwin's face, Turin's childhood laughter, the dragon's breath stealing her past. And now this unspeakable truth, this love twisted into abomination. Turin, stumbling forward in horror, reached for her, but his touch was fire. The curse had saved its most exquisite cruelty for last, not just to break them, but to make them the instruments of each other's ruin. Niënor's final act was not a scream, not a plea, but a flight into the river's embrace, her body vanishing beneath the current, as if the earth itself could not bear to hold such sorrow. And Turin, he stood alone on the riverbank, his sword heavy in his hand, the dragon's corpse grinning up at him. Victory tasted like ashes. For all his strength, all his defiance, he had played his part perfectly. The pawn who thought himself a king. The curse had never needed chains or shackles. It had only ever needed his heart. The air in Brethil was thick with the stench of burning pines and charred earth as Glaurung's massive form loomed over the treetops, his scales glinting like tarnished gold in the dying light. Turin, his sword blackened with soot and his hands trembling not from fear, but from a lifetime of suppressed rage, stood his ground. The dragon's laughter rumbled like distant thunder, a sound that slithered under the skin and coiled around the spine. Little son of Huron, Glaurung hissed, his voice dripping with mock pity. Do you still believe your sword can cut deeper than fate? Every word was a needle, each syllable designed to burrow into the cracks of Turin's resolve. But this time, the man who'd once been Niënor, who'd worn names like armor, did not flinch. With a roar that echoed his father's defiance, he drove his blade into the beast's belly, the steel biting deep as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Glaurung's shriek split the sky, a sound so piercing it sent birds scattering from the branches for miles. The dragon writhed, his tail smashing boulders to dust, his wings beating uselessly against the ground. Yet even as life bled from him, his malice burned brighter. You think this is victory? He gasped, his golden eyes locking onto Turin's. Look behind you, child of sorrow. See what your love has wrought. And there, emerging from the trees like a ghost, was Niënor, her face pale, her steps unsteady, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. Glaurung's final breath carried the truth like a curse unraveling in the wind. Niënor, daughter of Huron, he whispered, how fitting that your brother's hand should be your end. The world seemed to stop. Niënor's hands flew to her temples as if she could physically grasp the memories flooding back the face of her mother, the name she'd lost, the brother she'd wed. The scream that tore from her throat was less sound than pure anguish, a raw, wordless cry that seemed to come from the earth itself. Turin staggered forward, his sword slipping from his grip, his voice cracking as he called her name. Not Niënor, but Niënor, the sister he'd failed to recognize. She recoiled as if his touch were flame, her eyes wild with a pain beyond tears. No, she breathed, the word barely audible. Not this, not us. And then she was running, her feet carrying her toward the ravine's edge before Turin could reach her. The river below swallowed her without a sound, its waters closing over her as if she'd never been. Turin's knees hit the ground with a force that should have shattered them. He clutched at the dirt, his fingers digging into the earth as if he could pull back the moment, rewrite the story, undo the unthinkable. But the curse had always been patient. It had waited for this exact blow, the one that would break not just his body, but his very will to stand again. The sword lay beside him, its edge still slick with Glaurung's blood, a tool of vengeance turned instrument of his own despair. In the end, it was not the dragon's fire or Morgoth's chains that felled him, but the weight of a truth too cruel to bear, that every step he'd taken to escape his fate had only led him closer to it. When they found his body, the blade was buried deep in his chest, his hands still wrapped around the hilt, as if in some final, futile act of defiance. 2 graves were dug beneath the whispering trees of Brethil, their markers unadorned. No songs were sung, no tales woven of their deeds. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the earth itself understood that some sorrows are too vast for words. Morgoth's curse had run its course, not with thunder or flame, but with the terrible silence of a love that could not save, only destroy. And yet, perhaps this was the tragedy's sharpest edge. Their story did not end in darkness, but in a fragile, fleeting moment of clarity, that even in the wreckage of their lives, they had chosen each other, again and again, until the world left them no choice at all. The wind howled through the broken timbers of the house, where Morwin had once sung lullabies to her children. Time had gnawed at the walls like a starving beast, leaving only skeletons of stone and splintered wood. She stood in the doorway, her cloak heavy with the dust of 100 lonely roads, her hands trembling not from age, but from the news that had finally reached her. Whispers of Turin's fall, of Niënor's vanishing, of a river that had taken everything. The strength that had carried her through years of exile, the fire that had defied even Morgoth's shadow, guttered like a candle in a storm. Here, in the ruins of all she had loved, Morwin sank to her knees, her breath shallow, her eyes dry. There were no tears left, only the crushing weight of a truth, too vast to name, that every step she'd taken to shield her children had been a step toward this moment. Some say she died of grief that very night, her body folding into the earth like a leaf, returning to the soil. Others claim she lingered for days, her fingers tracing the grooves in the floor where tiny feet had once run, her voice whispering names that no one answered. But all agree on this: when her spirit finally slipped free, it was not with a cry, but a sigh, as if even in death, she was too weary for rage. The curse had taken her last, not with violence, but with the slow, methodical cruelty of a hand unclasping, finger by finger, from the edge of a cliff. And then Huron, after decades chained to Morgoth's throne, forced to witness his family's unraveling like a play staged for his torment, the Dark Lord at last released him. Not from mercy, but from the certainty that freedom would hurt more than captivity. The man who stumbled from Angban's gates was a ghost of the warrior who had once defied a god. His hair was white as ash, his face carved with lines deeper than scars. He moved as if the very air were heavy, drawn to the one place Morgoth had promised he would find answers. But answers were not what awaited him in Dor Laman, only graves. The earth had claimed Morwin quietly, without marker or ceremony, as though even the land wished to forget. Huron knelt in the dirt, his fingers digging into the soil, as if he could pull her back through sheer will. The defiance that had once made Morgoth rage now lay shattered within him. He had believed his unbroken spirit would shield them. Instead, it had painted a target on their backs. Every choice, every proud refusal to bend, had been a thread in the noose that strangled them all. When he lifted his head at last, his eyes were not wet with tears, but burning with a terrible clarity. The curse had never been about breaking him. It had been about making him watch as everything he loved broke instead. And in that moment, Huron did something far more devastating than roar his anger to the heavens. He laughed, a sound so hollow it echoed like a bell in an empty hall. Because the final joke, the one Morgoth had saved for last, was this: the Dark Lord had won not by making Huron despair, but by letting him live long enough to understand. The wind carried his laughter away, scattering it over the hills where his children had once played. Somewhere beyond the shadows, Morgoth smiled. And Huron, who had once stood unbowed before the might of hell, finally learned the weight of a truly unbearable burden, not chains, not pain, but the knowledge that even the strongest love can be twisted into a weapon, and the bravest heart can do nothing to stop it. Huron's fingers closed around the jagged stone, its edges biting into his palm like teeth. The weight of it was nothing compared to the weight of his grief, the years of torment, the hollow victory of outliving his wife and children, only to find their graves. The halls of Angband stretched before him, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, but his eyes were fixed on the dark throne looming at its heart. Morgoth sat there, a smirk twisting his lips, not in triumph, but in amusement. He had expected rage, tears, perhaps even the broken silence of surrender, but Huron's voice, when it came, was eerily calm. "You took everything," he said, "and still you are empty." The stone flew before Morgoth could reply. It struck the base of the throne with a crack that echoed through the cavernous hall, a sound small and futile against the vastness of the Dark Lord's dominion. No tremor shook the earth, no fissure split the stone. It was the rebellion of a single ant against a mountain, and yet the act itself was a spark in the dark. Huron had known it would change nothing. That wasn't the point. The point was that after decades of chains, after watching his family's lives unravel like thread, he had chosen, one final time, to spit in the face of fate. Morgoth's laughter followed him as he turned away, a sound like grinding boulders. "Run, little king," the Dark Lord mocked. "Run until your legs give out, until your breath fails. There is no place in this world where my shadow does not reach." But Huron was already walking, his steps unsteady but deliberate. He had no destination. The wilds would claim him, as they had claimed so many before. The wind would scatter his bones, and the rain would wash his name from the stones. And yet, as he vanished into the gathering twilight, something lingered in the air, not defiance, not even sorrow, but the quiet, unshakable truth that some lights refuse to be swallowed, no matter how deep the dark. Far beneath the earth, in a hidden hall, even Morgoth's gaze could not pierce. The Silmaril pulsed faintly in its cradle of stone. Its radiance was dimmed, but not extinguished. The jewel Huron had once sought in vain, the symbol of a hope he could no longer grasp, waited. For though his story ended in solitude, the tale of Middle-earth was not yet done. The Silmaril would find another hand, another heart brave enough to carry its light into the shadows. And so, even in the ashes of Huron's tragedy, the thread of hope remained thin as a spider's silk, unbroken. The story of Huron's children does not end with their deaths, nor with the crumbling of their house into dust. It lingers, like the last note of a song that refuses to fade, like the imprint of footsteps in wet clay, long after the rain has washed them away. This is not just a tale of doom, though doom hangs heavy over every chapter. It is a testament to the terrible beauty of love, the kind that persists even when the world conspires to twist it into something unrecognizable. Turin, with his unyielding pride, and Niënor, with her stolen memories, were not merely victims of Morgoth's curse. They were flares of defiance in the dark, proof that even the most carefully woven threads of fate can fray when met with the raw, untamed force of the human heart. Think of the moments that could have changed everything. If Turin had swallowed his pride in Darius, if Niënor had never followed Glaurung's trail, If Morwin had stayed in Dor Laman instead of chasing whispers of her son, what then? But that's the cruelest trick of tragedy. It makes us believe there was ever a choice. Morgoth's curse was not a chain, but a current, pulling them toward rocks they could see but never avoid. Yet in their struggle against it, in their refusal to surrender, even when surrender might have spared them pain, they became something more than pawns. They became a warning, yes, but also a beacon. For all the sorrow woven into their story, there's a strange comfort in its telling. It reminds us that grief is not the opposite of love, but its shadow. That to love fiercely is to risk devastation, and yet we love anyway. Huron's family was broken, but they were never small. Even in their darkest hours, they burned bright Turin with his sword raised against impossible odds, Niënor with her quiet courage, Morwin with her unshakable loyalty. Their lives were not measured by their suffering, but by the moments they refused to let that suffering define them, and so their legacy endures, not as a cautionary tale, but as a whisper carried on the wind through the valleys of Middle-earth. When the elves sing of old sorrows, their names rise like embers from the fire. When mortal men speak of courage, it is Turin's face they see in the flickering torchlight. The curse is gone, spent like a storm that has finally exhausted its rage, but the memory of those it touched remains. A reminder that even in a world heavy with darkness, some lights are too stubborn to be extinguished. Perhaps that's why we return to their story again and again, not for the despair, but for the fleeting glimpses of hope that pierce through it, for the love that outlasted doom, for the defiance that outran despair, for the unbroken thread of humanity that even Morgoth could not sever. The Children of Hrin did not escape their fate, but in the end, they did something far more profound. They made it mean something, and that is a victory no curse can ever erase.